So our second snippet for this week looks at events in um, Latin America, especially in the Caribbean basin, Mexico and Central America, plus the nations of the Caribbean, which are a major aspect of 1920s U.S. Foreign policy. The U.S. is very aggressive in the region, and this is also an area of enormous domestic political controversy. And although the U.S. is still occupying Haiti during this period and still has the Platt Amendment with regards to Cuba, allowing it to intervene, the two big countries in terms of U.S. Western Hemisphere relations during the 1920s are Mexico and Nicaragua. So this man here is Plutarco Calles, who is the president of Nicaragua during the president of Mexico during the 1920s. The Mexican Constitution, which was created after the Mexican Revolution in the 19 teens, establishes a quite powerful presidency, but with one major check that the president can only serve 6 years in office, a single term, and then cannot run for re-election. So the idea is that this will guard against despotism. Calles is an interesting figure. He is in many ways quite conservative, but he recognizes the need to sort of advance revolutionary rhetoric. And so after his installation in 1926, he promotes a new Mexican constitution and argues that Mexico is going to be more economically nationalist in dealing with the major powers of the world, especially the United States. And the key provision of this new Mexican constitution, which had been adopted before Calles but really hadn't been enforced, is this Article 27. So Mexico in the 19 teens, there had been a lot of oil discovered in Mexico. U.S. and European oil companies had sort of set up oil wells and it kind of dominated the country's oil industry. Article 27 says that all of the oil, ownership of the lands and waters within boundaries of the national territories is vested originally in the nation, and it makes clear that these natural resources, they can be leased out, but they cannot be owned by a foreign entity. There's a war scare between the United States and Mexico in 1927 and into 1928 when Calles threatens to enforce Article 27, and the Coolidge administration, which is very pro-business, threatens to send U.S. troops to prevent him. Ultimately, the two sides kind of back away from this, but this will be an issue in U.S.-Mexican relations until 1938, when the Mexican government finally says enough and expropriates U.S. Oil possessions in the region. Now, the Coolidge administration's criticisms of Calles are quite popular among conservative Republicans, but generate very strong resistance from left-wing members of the Senate, mostly Republican. Remember, there are a lot of these one-party Republican states in the Midwest where the Republican Party is quite leftist, who argue that this kind of imperialistic approach towards Mexico and other countries in the Caribbean basin is the U.S. Kind of using its military might to promote business interests. And these senators who called the peace progressives tend to be quite populist. They tend to be kind of anti-business, would sort of be Bernie Sanders types, although there are other ways where they're very different than Sanders. But they want a more aggressive federal governmental policy to rein in the excesses of big business, and they see in intervention in the Caribbean basin the U.S. Compromising its ideals to serve the interests of business interests like oil companies in Mexico. The big domestic issue, though, during the 1920s with regards to Latin America comes in Nicaragua. So remember the Taft administration a couple snippets back had sent Marines to Nicaragua. Those Marines stick around until 1925. They're finally pulled out. When they are pulled out, another sort of string of political unrest results in the country. Remember, Nicaragua had this liberal party and conservative party, but there's not a lot of ideological difference between the two. The sense is that the conservatives are more pro-American. And in 1927, President Coolidge, sort of wanting to reestablish order, sends Marines to Nicaragua. He does not, and this is critical, he does not seek U.S. military intervention. congressional authorization for U.S. military intervention. The setting of the Marines follows up on a mediation effort by this man, Henry Stimson, who will be Secretary of State and then Secretary of War, now Secretary of Defense. Stimson goes to Nicaragua, gets a deal between the liberals and the conservatives, under which there's an agreement that the conservatives who were governing Nicaragua at that time would stay in office until 1928, but then there would be an election that would occur under U.S. military supervision. And the sense was that the liberals who had been sort of formulating the unrest, that the liberals would win that election because they seemed to be the more popular party. All of the leading liberals sign the Stimson Treaty except for one, this man, Augusto Sandino, who sees in the Stimson proposal, I think correctly in retrospect, betrayal of Nicaraguan nationalism. Sandino is a kind of leftist type. He's not a communist, but very nationalistic. And he takes up a military effort against the U.S. Marines that are stationed in Nicaragua. And the result is a quite difficult war in 1927, 1928, 1929. These are U.S. Marines stationed in Nicaragua during the 1920s. The Sandino forces would kind of blend into the civilian population. This is a problem the U.S. is going to have later on in Vietnam, most recently, I think, in Afghanistan. And Sandino was appealing to Nicaraguan nationalism as well. He becomes very popular in the Western Hemisphere. There are a lot of sort of positive articles about him. He's quite popular, actually, even in the United States. And the Peace Progressives, who again are the mostly Republican group, but the way the Senate breaks down in the 1920s, the Peace Progressives kind of have the balance of power. Those of you who follow New York State politics, they're sort of the equivalent of the Independent Democrats, this caucus that was between the Democrats and Republicans in the state Senate for most of the 20-teens. The two most prominent of these senators are William Borah, who's a Republican senator from Idaho, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and George Norris, a Republican senator from Nebraska. And in 1927, and then especially in 28 and 29, they propose using the powers that the Constitution gives to Congress, particularly the power to spend, to get the U.S. out of this undeclared war in Nicaragua. And their proposal is to eliminate all funds for the interventions. The idea here is if there's no money for it, there's no way that they can, that Coolidge will be able to keep U.S. troops in. Coolidge does have some Senate defenders. The most prominent is this man, Hiram Bingham, who was a Republican senator from Connecticut. And in the debate over U.S. military presence in Nicaragua, it's quite an argument here from Bingham. When Norris wants to be technical about the use of the term war, he should be careful to distinguish between the use of the word Marines, who everyone recognizes may be properly used in foreign countries for the protection of American life and property. So basically what Bingham and the supporters of the Coolidge administration are saying is, look, this isn't really a war. It's kind of a police action. And yes, there are U.S. Marines there. And yes, they are firing on Nicaraguans and they're getting fire back. But it's simply protection for American life and property. No one really believes this. The most radical of the Peace Progressives is this man, John Blaine, who's a Republican senator from Wisconsin. Blaine had defeated, remember from the question and answer video, that guy Irvine Lenroot, who won the special election in Wisconsin that gave the Senate to the Republicans during the League of Nations battle. Blaine had beaten him in a primary. And Blaine argues that the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua is a betrayal of American ideals. The blood of these boys, of these men, of these women and children is upon the hands of those who have directed the hostile and war activities against the Republic of Nicaragua, acts contrary to all precedent in the history of this republic, contrary to law, the Constitution of this republic, contrary to the rules and customs that prevail among nations of the world. This is, for criticism from a senator, of an existing war. This is pretty tough rhetoric. And the Peace Progressives surprised the Coolidge administration just on Coolidge's way out and get together behind an amendment sponsored by this guy, C.C. Dill, who's a Democratic senator from Washington State who was ideologically sympathetic to the Peace Progressive cause. And this Dill amendment cuts off funds for the Marine intervention in Nicaragua, which is the first step to bringing the intervention to an end. Ultimately, the U.S. troops will take a couple more years to withdraw, but by the early 30s, they're out of Nicaragua. So the big stories with regards to U.S.-Latin American relations during the 1920s is this battle over nationalism, with the U.S. sort of considering war with Mexico before pulling back, basically going to war with the Sandino faction in Nicaragua. And the resistance that these policies generate from this left-wing group of senators who use their leverage in the Senate to make it hard for the executive to be as aggressive as both Harding and especially Coolidge wanted to be in the region. And that is it for our second snippet.